Welcome to Transmission Podcast. I'm your host, Cecilia Lynn Jacobs. For the next little while, we invite you to speculate on the possibility of life on Proxima b, the closest known planet outside of our solar system that has the potential to support life. In each episode, we question what would happen if we suddenly knew we were no longer alone in the universe, and what that would mean for humanity to become an interstellar civilization. Please, stay close.
Any radio telescope receiver with a little bit of jiggery-pokery in electronics can be turned into a transmitter. So we have the technology to send signals, and we have sent a lot of signals over the last 50-odd years of varying strengths and in varying directions. So we have quite a few options in that regard of sending a radio transmission. We can send an optical transmission as well. We can fire, we can build a laser effectively that can fire a signal. Works on a very similar principle, but you can really focus the beam so you can really pick a target. So we can do either of these things. And we know that we can send radio transmissions out to several hundred light years from the Earth. If we picked a laser with specifications that are now quite out of date, we did this calculation about 10 years ago, we reckon that we could send a signal, maybe 3,000 light years, which is quite far. The Milky Way is 100,000 light years across, so that gives you a sense of how far we can go, which is not hugely far. But if somebody's in the local neighborhood, we can say hi.
On this episode of Transmission Podcast, we're talking back. This episode, we heard from Duncan Forgan at University St Andrews. If we were to clear the hurdle of translation after confirming an extraterrestrial signal, we already have the technology to send a reply to our closest exoplanets. But the bigger question is, what should we say in return? And how do we craft a reply? Peter Worden from Breakthrough Initiatives has a few ideas.
Whatever signal they've transmitted, we might try to communicate with a directed beam of, if it's a particular radio frequency or a particular optical frequency. The first attempt would be, let's just send something on that channel back. We have the technology, if it's not just leakage, that we're actually focusing on something with relatively minor, optical or radio systems. You can send a pretty coherent signal pretty far away.
My imagined scenario, if we got contact with a civilization light years away, would be to kind of try to do these Skype sessions with a delay of, say, 4 years.
That's Dr. Christine Corbett-Moran at Caltech.
Imagine writing yourself a letter 4 years in the future. The time delay of information would be large, but you could record some information and send it. So if people got the ability to communicate, I could imagine for a long time just trying to find these ways of communicating with people with a 4-year time delay. So send a video and send updates. It's like people used to do this from the new world to the old world, where letters would take months and months and months or years to arrive, but you still had some communication. So I think that would be the mode that would probably happen the longest, unless they were so advanced that they could come to visit us.
Seth Shostak from SETI suggests that we commit to continual broadcasting, and even went so far as to suggest that we broadcast the entire internet.
I mean, you just broadcast it, right? You could broadcast it on a radio beam. You could certainly do that. It would take, a while. It might take a month to send it on a radio beam. It's pretty big, but that's okay. Or you could put it on a laser beam, a very powerful laser beam, and then you get it there in a couple of days. Because, light can carry greater numbers of bits than radio. I mean, anybody who has a fiber optic into their house these days or the internet knows that's true. So, you could do it. You just send it all. And sure, most of it is in English and most of it is HTML encoding and all that stuff. But the internet has so much information. It's quite conceivable that at the other end the aliens turn their computers on it and they look for redundant things like, the letters, I don't know, CANADA over and over and over. They don't know what the letters are, but they can recognize that those funny characters appear over and over, and sometimes with photos and sometimes with some sound, sometimes with videos, and pretty soon they can figure out what that means. So, they probably have automated investigation of this to begin with, and you do that until you know enough to understand the language.
Do you think it would make sense to send the entirety of the internet, or would it be kind of like picking selected highlights, like the global highlights?
Well, who's going to decide what are the highlights? Personally, I would just send it all. That's my opinion, and I've actually I've written that up and published it. But I've had some people who don't agree. The most interesting objection seems to be that there's pornography on the internet, and I don't know why this is an objection. I can't imagine that the aliens would be offended by our pornography any more than I'm offended by the fact that most of the dogs and cats in my neighborhood are running around without any clothes.
So you think it just wouldn't translate all of the taboos and restrictions that we have that are coming to bear in our discussions about what we send over might just not even be relevant, and therefore we shouldn't worry about it?
I wouldn't worry about it. I don't think it's terribly relevant. What if the ancient Greeks, if somehow you could get this kind of information from the ancient Greeks, would you want them to say, well, we better not tell them about, the bad behavior of Titus down the whatever. I guess that's a Roman name, but down the street here and so forth. And don't show them those, nude drawings or anything like that. Come on, you would want to see all that stuff because you're just interested in their culture. You want to learn something, and you're not terribly worried about being offended. They're famous. Scientists who study ants, and ants go to war with one another all the time. But, they're not put off by this kind of strange, behavior that they wouldn't accept in their own species. It's a different species. Whatever they do, and let's just look at it.
I guess if you were trying to have cultural exchange, you would just keep on broadcasting.
Just continuous broadcasting. And so that, and then hopefully the other side does the same. And then you at least get to keep up with each other, but with a 3-year delay.
Yeah.
Like colonial America getting British papers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
That's Dr. Beth Biller at the Royal Observatory in the University of Edinburgh. But there's more to think about than just a time delay.
I guess it's also the issue of what do they think about the whole situation? The issue of trust.
Yeah, trust and desire and preferences. We already seem to have some issues with that locally. I would be interested to see how exponential one can get with those kinds of issues.
Humans, in terms of first contacts among ourselves even, we haven't done that well.
No, we're not very good at it. It's true. Kind of universally, consistently low D's. C's, I'd say, if you're going to put it to a grade range.
So we're free to transmit even if we don't have a signal. If we like, we can turn a radio telescope into a transmitter and start sending stuff if we want to. And we've sent quite a lot of signals. They've not been agreed by any state. They don't necessarily reflect the opinions of Earth. They reflect the opinions of the transmitters and the countries they come from. And there are two definite camps as to whether this is a good idea. There are the people who think, yep, this is the way to do it, absolutely. And then there are the people who say this is a bad idea.
That's Duncan Forgan again, reminding us that, likely, there are already signals out to the stars, but there are no global regulations about what to send.
So the people who say it's a good idea will say, actually, intercepting a transmission is hard. The best way to get a transmission from someone is to say hi first. Let's be proactive. And there's a good chance they'll be benevolent. So let's just go for it. Everything will be fine. The other camp, which is the camp I tend to fall in, is this is potentially a very vulnerable point for us. If they are more advanced, but they see us as a weak target, is that a good thing? It's not necessarily going to result in alien invasion and, flying saucers on the White House lawn. It might end up in a much more subtle scenario where they start to manipulate us for their own purposes or for their own entertainment. And we can see how manipulation of media can end up in terrible results. So I think there are a lot of dangers we haven't fully explored about sending a signal without knowing who's on the other side. And the community is split almost 50-50. So if you speak to scientist, if you take a representative sample, roughly half will say, yeah, transmission is fine, and the other half will say, no, don't do it.
Seth Shostak doesn't think there's harm in transmitting or in sending a lot of information about us. He does, however, think listening first is a priority.
It's not that I'm advocating that we broadcast into space. There are people who want to do that, but we're looking for signals. We're not trying to broadcast anything. There are people who have done that and who want to do it in the future, but we don't even have the equipment to broadcast anything into space. But I have said that if we do broadcast, what I would say is, let's send them a lot of information, and I suggested the internet. But the problem with that is, even if you don't worry about danger, and I don't, by the way, still you're not going to get a response very quickly. So that's a really long-term experiment. You may be long dead before the experiment succeeds, if it ever succeeds. Whereas listening, you have at least a chance of short-term success. So I think that that's kind of the attitude that infuses the people doing SETI, that, all we need to do is find the right direction to point the antennas, tune it to the right frequency, and we'll pick up some evidence that says there's somebody there. So that's in general what we try and do.
However, there may be another way to communicate that doesn't involve sending messages at all. Perhaps we become a starfaring civilization by transmitting us as information from place to place. Pete Worden explains how this might be more feasible than many other options.
You could transmit genome information and print out the genome and then boot up life. And we can't quite do that yet, but that seems to be in the next 10 or 15 years. So obviously one of the other concepts is that if we've established a long-range communications with these intelligences, that, maybe the long-term step is that we begin to transmit substantial enough information that, you could reconstruct each other at the other end.
Perhaps the secret is not talking or even transmitting. Maybe it's building. Stay close. We'll be back after a short break. Welcome back. In this episode of Transmission Podcast, we're discussing how we might respond to an alien signal. We've been speaking a bit with Dr. Christine Corbett-Moran, and she reminded us about the difficulties of interstellar communication, which, by the way, if you haven't listened to episode 3 about translating alien language, you might want to go back and have a listen. Anyways, let's hear from Christine.
I think it's easy to underestimate the difficulty of communicating. So I'm not sure that we would find a common language of communication easily at all to discuss more abstract concepts, technology transfer, that sort of stuff, especially with the huge time delay involved. I think almost the more likely scenario is less science fiction, but more that we get kind of our claws into a little bit of communication, but we never really get very far with it, and at some point it just peters out. Either we on the Earth side lose the funding to invest in further investigations or transmissions, or something happens on their side and it just stops. I mean, that's kind of a depressing vision, but that's, even if we do establish some sort of communication, I could imagine it being halting and never getting to these abstract concepts.
This distance is something that we can barely understand. Dr. Aaron Zimmerman at CITA helps put it in perspective.
You're thinking about things that are happening a billion light years away, right? It's a funny thing. For us, we just get used to these numbers. We get used to sets of scales. So you think about different kinds of scales. We think about scales on Earth. We think about scales in a lab. We think about the sizes of things in our solar system, the sizes of distances between stars, the sizes of galaxies, and so on. And so you always have a reference point, right? You have a reference point of, I'm thinking now about the scale of galaxies. So I'm thinking about 10,000 light years. Or I think about the size of the universe, and now I'm thinking about a billion light years or more, 13 billion light years. We just hold these rulers in our head, and we don't actually sit and appreciate what they mean, I think, as far as our own personal experience goes. So, what you were saying there about like distances and years, light years are convenient because, of course, that's usually the amount of time that it's taken the signal to propagate to us. Because when we see a signal, it's almost